Good evening and welcome. Welcome to the first Irish Popcorn series of Solas Nua's monthly film event. Tonight, a special treat, Yeats, A Vision. This non-narrative, creative, and experimental piece is a visual and auditory treat, inspired by the life, imagination, and work of William Butler Yeats. The film itself runs just a little over an hour. We will have both the question and answer functions open where you can direct questions to our two fabulous panelists. We have Professor Colleen Parsons, an associate professor of English at Georgetown University, and we have the director of the piece, Alan Gilsenan, who will join Colleen in a conversation about the film afterwards. As always, we want to thank Tom McIntyre and his fabulous crew for making this viewing possible. And now I ask you to sit back, grab your popcorn, your drink of choice, and enjoy Yeats, A Vision.
Alan, what a beautiful, moving, meditative film. It's truly extraordinary. I don't know if you've seen some of the comments coming in here on the chat and the question and answer. It has moved people. Hard not to. Let me just say a couple of words before I talk to Alan. A reminder, I'm Colleen Parsons. I teach in Georgetown. I'm on the board of Solas Nua as well. This is Alan Gilsenan, who is the director of this amazing film that we had in front of us. And I just want to say thanks very quickly to Kate Meenan-Waugh and to Sean and Tom at Solas Nua and NYU for inviting both of us to be part of this tonight. But a special word of thanks to Alan, because Alan's in Ireland and it's the middle of the morning. It's 7 minutes past 1 in the morning, and he's in Glencree in the Dublin Wicklow Mountains. I mean, what else would you do at 1 o'clock in the morning, Alan, besides be here with us? I was just thinking, Glencree is only a couple of valleys over from Glenmalure, where John Millington Synge was spending his nights with his ear to the ground, listening to the murmur of voices. Are you doing any of that tonight?
I'm always hearing that up here. Really lovely to be with you all, and a real pleasure. And somehow this hour of the dark night in the dark mountain seems the right time to look at this film again. But yeah, Synge indeed in the valley that I'm in, the Glencree Valley. Synge also has an association here, so yeah, we're always on the lookout for ghosts.
He went tramping, Synge out in his pampooties, as Stephen, no, it's a book Mulligan, I can't remember actually, says of John Millington Synge. Just as a couple of people actually have asked a question like this. Tell us where the inspiration for this came from. Like, how did this film start? And there's another sort of part of that actually a few people have asked, which is, how did you bring together the images, the music, the words, but also the manuscript? And we'll talk maybe a little bit more about the manuscripts. So maybe give us a sense of where this all came from.
Well, I suppose, films have a kind of, certainly for me, they have a multitude of starting points. You're never quite sure where it finds its feet. And this, this is a strange little film. And I suppose there were two starting points. One was practical and one less so. I had the privilege of doing another project many years ago with the National Library in Dublin. And as part of that, they gave me access to all the Yeats collection they have, an extraordinary array of manuscripts, notebooks, photographs, and it was a real honor, to spend time with that material. And I suppose the filmmaker in me, I'd always loved Yeats, that's a given, but the filmmaker in me responded to this extraordinary visual material, particularly the notebooks around Yeats's interest in the occult. So I felt that there was this extraordinary visual resource, which of course as a filmmaker you grasp onto. The other side to it was, like so many people around the world, a great love of Yeats and his work, but also felt that's, it's very easy for a national poet, as Yeats has become, to become you know, kind of slightly ossified, fossilized as this kind of respectable figure, and the same poems are churned out, beautiful that they are. And I felt that there was a kind of a strangeness to him. I think you mentioned when we talked before, but there was this extraordinary imaginative world, particularly around his interest in the occult and theosophy, which was a really profound interest that I was drawn to. And so the film kind of evolved. I think initially, you know, when I saw that visual material, I imagined this extraordinary kind of explosion of kind of imagery. But of course, you know, that was just my own vanity. And of course, you know, when I got into it, I realized, of course, you know, a very obvious conclusion that to bombard the audience with imagery all the time, of course, would do a disservice to the poems. So sometimes, in a way, I talk about this film kind of as a non-film, you know, because in the process of editing it, we were sort of taking stuff out. And I really thought, I said this to my editor, Emer Reynolds, you know, if I was really brave, I'd just have a black screen and we just hear the poems, you know. So this is kind of, so I suppose the idea in bringing the imagery together was to go on a kind of subjective, I mean, there is, you know, a vague chronology through the film, the chronology of his life. But really what I wanted to give the audience was, you know, in a way that you could go on a kind of trip, you know, that you could sit in a dark cinema and you could go on this journey that was as much about your own imagination provoked by Yeats's writing as it was about the film. And that, you know, a certain ambiguity in the imagery was to allow people's own mind to swim.
Alan, if only we could sit in a darkened cinema right now. That seems like heaven. Just to follow up on that, and you know, I mean, I think nobody watching this could mistake the occultist elements of Yeats that you sort of hone in on. I think, you know, in many ways, many of us will know Yeats, will know the sort of Easter 1916, we'll know some of the early mythical stuff. But in many ways, the part of Yeats that has been occluded or occulted in a way is the part that mattered most to him. And that is his interest in magic, his interest in, you know, all of the things that we can laugh at, you know, table rapping and seances and whatever, ectoplasm, whatever you want. But I guess I wanted to sort of pay, you know, attention to the fact that you really zone in on the weirdness of Yeats and how, you know, how in a way a film like this with all of its sort of images, score can capture that that thing that has been lost about him. And I guess I wanted to ask you about you know, was that a particular focus for you, or did that just emerge from just reading Yeats?
No, I think it was a focus. You know, I think it's when I read his book of Vision, you know, one of his later works, very obtuse, difficult book, you know, that really excited me. And you know, I remember the great, you know, Yeats biographer, Roy Foster, of course. I remember him saying to me, and it really stuck, you know, because as you rightly say, we think of the occult and theosophy and seances all as some sort of, you know, strange, outmoded notion. And I remember Roy Foster saying to me, you know, that this was Yeats's enduring passion. This wasn't a flirtation, you know, and there's certain aspects about all our heroes, but somebody like Yeats, where we sort of grasp onto what's manageable, what's acceptable, you know. And there were aspects of his life, a flirtation with fascism in Italy at a certain point, you know, which aren't as easily grasped as the rest of him. But I think his commitment, and I suppose it was those notebooks, the detail, the color, the extraordinary amount of thought and energy and work went into them, reinforced for me how profound this was for Yeats. And, you know, it was interesting watching the film now with you all, having not watched it for years. And once I got over my own embarrassment, that opening kind of manifesto of Yeats, that I believe in magic, that I believe, that there is a collective mind, that I believe somehow that the past, the present, and the future coexist, that we have some sort of shared collective memory. I kind of believe that,
Yeah.
I mightn't have as sophisticated a grasp of it as Yeats, God bless us, but I kind of believe that, that's the essence of any art, actually, this sort of shared spiritus mundi that we all have, that art somehow transmits to us. And I think that's what really drew me to it, and I'm not saying I really understood it, but I mean, it's interesting, kind of coincidentally, I dug out a vision again in recent weeks, and I think there's something quite profound there that we've forgotten, and I don't think we do justice to Yeats's intelligence by just dismissing it as a kind of fanciful notion.
Yeah, I mean, a vision, he wrote, for those who don't know, a vision is sort of, prose. On the one hand, it's world history. On the other hand, it's some sort of like poetic storehouse of images. It's so many things. We encounter Leo Africanus. We encounter these voices, these sort of remembered and half-remembered historical figures. But it's so there's a quote in here, so beautifully read, by the way, lovely rendering of Yeats's words. Was a quote in here where Yeats says that he will spend whatever remains of his life interpreting his wife Georgie Hyde-Lees's automatic writing. And in many ways, that's what A Vision, those two books, 1925 and then revised in 1937, and so much of his poetry after 1917 come out of that storehouse of images. But that leads me to a question that actually Pat Riley and Elizabeth Steele had, which is the question that we all need to ask, which is the automatic writing a crock of you-know-what? Or, where did it come from? I mean, is this something that, the questions like, did Georgie Hyde-Lees, did Georgie Yeats just make this up? Or, what's the sort of genealogy of this idea of automatic writing?
I don't know. It's probably the real answer, but I don't think it was, I don't think it was a ruse. I don't think it was something that they dreamt up between them. I think it was genuine, and you can interpret that in a multitude of ways, psychological projection. But I think it was very serious. I think George realized that. You could say in some ways, because he was a lot older than her when they met and married. Maybe you could say it was the cement in their marriage, that kind of shared adventure. But I think it was serious and genuine on both their parts. And of course, that's the fundamental with things like the afterlife or a spirit world or the occult or any of those things. They're founded on belief, so it's very hard for a non-believer to understand a believer. But I believe their belief was sincere and genuine and deeply, deeply felt.
I mean, it was a project of 20 years.
Yeah.
There is an automatic sincerity to spending 20 years working on that project. You mentioned so you talked about in many ways, and we can see this, that the film began with your encounter with manuscripts and with archives in the National Library. And if anyone has not seen the National Library's, well, you can't go now, but the National Library's Yeats exhibition, although indeed you can see some online, the incredibly, as you said, extraordinarily rich collection in the library. And I wanted to ask you about something you said earlier in our conversation. You said we can often think of these sort of these words, these phrases as being ossified, as being, to take another word, monuments of unaging intellect. But in some ways, the manuscripts that you use, tell a very different story. And I guess I wanted to ask you about the sort of the images of the manuscripts and what you felt that brought to the words that we know that are being recounted.
Yeah, I mean, I think they just seem to be beautiful, things in themselves, and often when original manuscripts, original drafts, letters are used in filmic terms, they're used to kind of illustrate the words. And often in the film, sometimes I did it, but often in the film I didn't. The words were at odds with the images. But for me, the actual objects were things of beauty. These notebooks, these manuscripts, these typescripts seem to me like pieces of visual art in themselves. I more recently have done a similar, very subjective, abstract response to Joyce's Ulysses for the Molly Museum here in Dublin, which, is a great place to go when you can go. But, and it was the same thing, I mean, Joyce had, a passionate interest in the visual aspect of his work. But, to look at all that material, not just as illustrating great writing, which of course it is, but actually to look at it as beautiful objects in themselves. And, in some cases in the Yeats film, I also played with copies, with paint and stuff. So I kind of slightly altered copies of, I obviously wasn't splashing paint on the originals on the quiet in the National Library when they weren't looking. But they are profoundly beautiful things in themselves. We don't really think of Yeats in those contexts. We think of Yeats as the great wordsmith, maybe the great dreamer, but in some ways you could almost see him as a kind of visual artist as well.
Yeah, I mean, and obviously visual art is in his family. You think about his father, think about his brother. I mean, there's a real visuality that leads me in a whole lot of different directions. But I just wanted to talk about those last scenes in the film, which are so incredibly moving. And I guess one of the things that I like about your use of the manuscripts is that we remember that there's a process behind this, that there's work, that there's error, there's rewriting. Yeats said, "Myself I must remake," right? There's rewriting, constant rewriting. Yeats is constantly thinking about how to shift sort of the poems from one version to another. I love that very last scene. Yeats is walking out. I don't know what he's walking out of, but there's a real balancing act there between the composed elder statesman, the monument of an aging intellect, right? The man, the poet in a sense, and the bundle of accident and incoherence that he talked about, that you have at the very beginning. This strange sort of man standing alone, staring at the camera, unsure what to do, always with an eye on the sort of the public image and the completed self. And yet there's a constant revision going on underneath that. I want to actually maybe change tack. We have a few questions, and I actually had this question as well for you. We have a couple of questions, and it was one of those Yeats manuscripts that you daubed paint on. We won't tell anybody. It's just a conversation between you and me here, Alan. Nobody knows. One of those manuscripts that you daubed paint on is a beautiful blue sort of swatch of paint that looks just like a bird. Yeah. And a couple of people have asked about the bird imagery throughout. So we know that Yeats thinks about symbols. You began in many ways thinking about like what a symbol is and sort of what a symbol carries. And I wanted to ask you about the birds that turn up. I don't know if you know the work of it. There's a great scholar called Kelly Sullivan who has just written about Yeats's birds. A beautiful piece. She gave a talk at the Yeats Summer School a couple of years ago. But I guess I want to give you an opportunity to answer the question about that people are really interested in. Why birds?
Yeah, I mean, my use and understanding of symbols is part accident and part knowledge, and certainly nowhere near as sophisticated as Mr. Yeats. Of course, there's a certain knowledge, and there's you've read, and I've kind of engaged with his work and with the scholarship. So you absorb this stuff. But I would have to say, as a filmmaker, particularly in this sort of film, I'm a great man for acting on instinct, so
Yeah.
I would be aware of things, but they aren't necessarily always logical, there's a great there's a great actor here, Tom Hickey. Many people will know Tom Hickey, and I remember him telling me he was working with the Polish director, and Tom, likes to work in a kind of slightly abstract way. And he was working with the Polish director once, and this is something he quoted often when I worked in the theater with him. And the Polish director asked him to do something he didn't really understand, and he said, why, or something. And the director said, "We know not what from where." And Tom would often quote that to me. "We know not what from where." If I'd say, "Why'd you do that?" "We know not what from where." And so kind of that's my answer. A lot of this, thing, particularly in a film like this, you do your reading, you bring a certain amount of intelligence to it in a modest way, but then you kind of give in to accident and to instinct, and some of that stuff is more coming from that place of accident than intent.
Yeah, and I think also comes from in a way that pays homage to the sense of the spiritus mundi, the great collective memory, like these images. I mean, you have that one moment where you have these images flashing in front of the screen, as if in a sort of a paratactical way. They're elusive. We don't know how they relate to each other, but they create a sort of an idea of an image of the world in many ways.
Yeah. I think in a way that's how we worked, both in filming it and editing. It was more that kind of, there wasn't necessarily a logical thing, but certain combinations seemed to work. And then certain combinations in combination with, the power of Yeats's words, I think freed our imaginations. I think if anything, the experience of sitting down and watching the film, I hope, sends people back to Yeats's work, because while some of the classics are in there, I also tried to, open the door a tiny bit to some of his more lesser known or more challenging poetry.
Yeah. So, I mean, well, let's go to one of the better known ones here, because there are a couple of questions, and I too had a question about the Second Coming, and the what it's like. I mean, let me put it. This is a question from Cheryl Stevenson. Let me sort of paraphrase and ask. The Second Coming, as we know, was written during a pandemic. Written during the 1918 flu pandemic. Yeats, experienced something like a lockdown that was different from what we are experiencing now, and certainly didn't involve. Well, there was a lot of connection actually with long distance connection. But you made this film 5 years ago now? You mentioned it's been a few years.
8, yeah. Right.
Well, I mean, I guess I wanted to ask you what it's like coming back to it at this moment. So at a moment when, I think we're very conscious of living in a world where things fall apart, the center cannot hold, where, all of those words, as Roy Foster says, the sort of Yeats index in a way, all of those phrases now are redolent and we can't escape them right now. And I was wondering whether you wanted to talk about the sort of what this film means to you now in this moment. You there in Glencree, locked down. Ireland has just announced another 6 weeks of lockdown. And that's not to say that Yeats must speak to our present moment, but it's very hard for us, I think, to avoid that.
Yeah, no, I think, and I think that is the power of his work. When I come back to the film, to talk about film for a minute, my first reaction is always horror. Oh Christ, I could have done that better. That's my default position. But once I get over that, I have a kind of soft spot for this strange little film. you know, that was done in a very kind of modest way. But more than that, I think, you know, the greatness of Yeats, you know, the greatness of Othello, for example. I have a daughter, Shakespeare, I have a daughter here who has just read Othello for the first time in school, and her mind is blown. But the greatness,
it's amazing.
Those sort of writers, you know, that you have a 15-year-old girl reading Othello, or we're returning to Yeats, is that you constantly return to them and they constantly reinvent themselves. I mean, that is the power of Yeats. That's why I think he will endure. That's why we're drawn back to him. That's why we can take some of his work as if it's our own, you know. And of course, The Second Coming at this point in time, you know, speaks to us, but I think it will continue to speak. I mean, I think that's the power of his imagination. And if anything, it probably in some ways that it speaks so readily to us at this moment in time. It's a confirmation, I think, of what Yeats was arguing, which is that time is fluid and that we exist in all time and no time together. You know, so in a way, you know, Yeats is in some way, the spirit of Yeats is here with us. And you could say almost that The Second Coming is a new poem. And that's, I think, down to the greatness of his imagination, of his creative genius, which I don't think is too big a word. And that's why it'll echo with us today, but it will also, I think, echo in the future, if hopefully we have one.
Yeah, I mean, I think the word that you're reaching for, not to put a word in your mouth, but the word that you're reaching for is the word that, well, Yeats wouldn't use it in this way, but like what we're talking about here, we're talking about historical transference, or we're talking about sort of revisiting something after 100 years. The other way we could think about it is a sort of a haunting, sort of a spiritual sort of movement, our spiritual sort of, you know, existence across these 100 and more years that in many ways Yeats, you know, anticipated and wrote about and thought about. Yeats actually had real difficulty imagining the future. He was good on the past. He was pretty good on the present. The future was really difficult for him. But, you know, to quote from Ulysses again, coming events cast their shadow before. Alan, I know it's late. Are you still awake? You seem to be still awake.
I am very much awake. Yeah, delighted to be.
Do you have time for another couple of questions, and then we'll let you. One of the you mentioned, and this in part follows up on what I was just what we were just talking about, and what you were talking about, because the film itself is chronological, more or less in chronological order. And a couple of people have asked about this. We asked whether it was, but also in a sense why. And I, you know, there's an intertwining of what the life of what Yeats might call the soul, and sort of, you know, historical events. And obviously 1916 is the point where these historical events come, you know, crashing together. I love that. I love the pausing on the adverts after 1916. The terrible beauty is that Hickey's is open again. Drapery and haberdashery, you can go and get your drapery and haberdashery again. But I guess I wanted to ask you, like, what would the film be like if it weren't chronological? How would we sort of rethink the time structure in many ways? Or had you thought about that?
I had, you know, and maybe had I been braver, that would have been the right approach. I suppose I felt, you know, that because in a way I was trying to take the viewer on this sort of kind of subjective trip through Yeats's imaginary life, you know, not the physical reality of his life, but the creative and imaginative reality of his life. And I felt that that was going to be a bit of a challenge, you know, for people, and that in a way, in a broad sense, you know, even though to be so chronological probably goes against Yeats's fundamental philosophy, but in a broad sense, in a filmic sense, I felt it just gave the audience something to hang on to, you know, that in some ways you are going on a journey, you know, from birth to death and a little beyond, and that it would give the viewer some route, some anchor in this kind of sea of Yeats's imaginary world.
Yeah, I think that's a good description. The sea of the imaginary world, these sort of swirling images where birds, you know, turn up again and again. Or you mentioned a few minutes ago, you mentioned that you're working on a film on Joyce right now, or you just finished a film on Ulysses. So maybe as a parting shot, and I think I've, you know, more or less addressed questions from the audience, not all of them, but thank you, by the way, to the audience for all of these questions. They really have been fantastic. I see Cheryl Stevenson is arguing with me, as she should be, in chat, saying that Yeats does in fact imagine the future. This is what a conversation, we're simulating what it would be like in person. So thank you so much to all of you. But as a parting shot, Alan, do you want to tell us what you're working on now? What's coming out in the future? What should we be looking out for? I mean,
I always have a kind of weird superstition about talking about what's coming out.
I get it, yeah.
But and often, you know, in film, you're always juggling different projects at different stages, you know. So, you know, at the moment during lockdown, I have actually been writing a couple of screenplays, which has been wonderful, you know, just to kind of sit at my desk for a while and write those, and hopefully they'll come through. As you mentioned, I've just completed a film quite similar to this in a way, inspired by Joyce's Ulysses. But I'm also, you know, in the more experimental vein, I'm also doing a intimate little film about what's called Bagatonia, which is the cultural milieu around Dublin from the 40s through to the 70s, you know, around the area of Baggot Street, the Grand Canal, of Kavanagh fame.
Yeah.
But that's also the area I grew up in Dublin. So I'm doing a strange little reflection on that, on that place and on the ghosts of that place. But, you know, as ever in film, you're juggling different things at different stages, but you just keep trying to keep the balls in the air, you know.
Well, I think this one landed quite well. Yeats, a vision. I'm looking forward to a film about the Bagatonia. I think you'll know this as well as anyone else, is that the 40s through the 70s are so often overlooked in Irish history, and especially in Irish letters and Irish culture, the sort of the dark ages of the 20th century. So outside of Kavanagh. So I'm looking forward to hearing more and seeing more about that. Alan, it's been a real pleasure. I think we should probably let you go to bed, right?
Well, I you know, if I was with you, I'd be, of course, in my cultural stereotype, I'd be suggesting a drink, but I might have a drink now to toast you all here.
I think that's reasonable. I think it's a good time for a whiskey. Alan,
Yeah.
It's been a pleasure. Congrats on the film, and I really look forward to seeing what's coming next. That's a beautiful, as I said, a meditative film, and I know that our audience has really enjoyed it. And I will a shout out, because this is the second time in a week that we here in Washington DC with Solas and my own organization Georgetown have been talking about Yeats and about Yeats's significance, because we had Joe Hassett last week talking about his extraordinary and beautiful new book Yeats Now. So this has been, I don't know what's coming up next week, but I hope there's some Yeats involved. But this has been a real pleasure to talk about Yeats and to spend so much time with his words and your image and your beautiful filmography. So I'm going to hand over to Kate Meenan Waugh, but for me, to the audience, thanks very much, and to Alan, thanks very much, and over to you, Kate.
Okay.
If I could just say thank you to the audience for their engagement, and to Colleen for your close attention and generosity. It's been a real pleasure to be with you all this evening. Kate.
Thank you so much, Alan. I was absolutely transfixed by the film. I just thought it was so beautiful. And Colleen, thank you as always for your masterful shepherding of the conversation. Yes, there's a lot going on with Solas Nuas. Tomorrow, 5 p.m., in conjunction with Georgetown University Global Irish Studies, which Colleen is very heartfelt with, we will be looking at the Republic of Shame, Ireland's Culture of Secrecy. Authors Kayleen Hogan and Catriona Palmer will have a discussion about that. And then February is jam-packed. Starting this Monday, we mark St. Bridget's Day with a special conversation with Landless, a 4-part a cappella group with Irish Times journalist Gemma Tipton. And we'll hear from Landless again March 8th. Special shout out and thank you to the Embassy of Ireland for supporting those events. February 11th, the Voices of Change series brings us Paradigm Shifts in the Arts, Part 1, Feminist Interventions. And February 17th is our next Irish Popcorn, I Am Immigrant, a wonderful little film followed with a discussion from the director and one of the people featured in the film. And of course, the buildup is to the Capital Irish Film Fest, so get your passes. Obviously, it's going to be online this year from March 4 to 14. We are partnering again with AFI, but you have 10 days that this pass will allow you to come on, view films, and see some of the very best contemporary Irish filmmaking right now. So please check our website, event section. There's lots of things going on. And as always, check into our book groups, poetry, fiction, nonfiction. Whew, there's a lot going on. So stick with us. And Alan, again, you have earned your whiskey and a good night's sleep. Thank you so much for a wonderful, wonderful film. And thank you, Colleen. We'll see you tomorrow.
Real
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.